Mr. Lawson, your ex-wife says you kicked in her door and burglarized her house.
What? I'm paralyzed from the waist down.
Wheelchair doesn't mean you can't commit crimes. I've seen people fake disabilities. Put your hands behind your back.
I fell! I need help getting back in my chair!
Oh my gosh.
Accuses him of kicking in a door. The man accuses him of kicking in a door. The man explains he's paralyzed from the waist down, has been for 15 years, can't kick, can't stand, can't walk. The detective says wheelchair doesn't mean he can't commit crimes, tells him to stand up. The man says that's what paralyzed means. The detective tries to handcuff him in the lobby, pulls his arms back, the wheelchair tips, the man falls onto the floor in front of everyone, unable to catch himself. He lies there in the middle of the police station lobby, handcuffed, unable to move his legs, unable to get back into his wheelchair. He asks for help. He asks for medical attention. He invokes his ADA rights. 17 minutes. Multiple officers walk past. Civilians check in at the front desk. No one helps him. This is Terrell Lawson, 45 years old, insurance claims adjuster, paralyzed 15 years from a car accident, father of a 15-year-old daughter, coaches adaptive basketball. He physically cannot commit the crime he's accused of. The evidence proves it. His wheelchair proves it. His medical records prove it. Detective Isaiah Coleman arrests him anyway, causes him to fall from his wheelchair onto the lobby floor, leaves him there for 17 minutes, refuses medical attention. This will cost $12.4 million. It will end Coleman's career. It will expose how racial profiling and disability discrimination intersect. And it will prove that even a wheelchair in front of your face won't stop some officers from seeing what they've already decided to see. Subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below if you think paralyzed people shouldn't be arrested for crimes requiring legs. 15 years ago, Terrell Lawson was a high school basketball coach. 6'4", athletic. His daughter Jasmine was 6 months old. On a Tuesday evening, Terrell drove home from practice. A drunk driver ran a red light, T-boned his car. He woke up in the hospital 3 days later. Spinal cord severed at T10, complete injury, no function below that level. He would never walk again, never feel anything below his waist. He was 30. His daughter was 6 months old. 6 months in rehabilitation, learning to live from a wheelchair, learning adaptive driving, learning to navigate a world built for walking. His wife Vanessa tried to adjust. For 2 years, the resentment grew quietly. They divorced when Jasmine was 2.5. Vanessa got primary custody. Terrell got every other weekend. He found work as an insurance claims adjuster. Remote, good pay, flexible. Paid child support on time every month. Lived in an accessible apartment. He coached adaptive basketball for kids with disabilities, teaching them disability changes how you do things, not whether you can do them. He learned to live with ableism, the assumptions, the stares, the people who talked to whoever was with him instead of to him, the buildings with steps and no ramps. But nothing prepared him for what happened when his ex-wife decided he'd broken into her house. Tuesday morning, 2 a.m., Vanessa's house was burglarized while she and Jasmine visited her sister overnight. Someone kicked in the front door, splintered the frame, required standing working legs, stole electronics, spray-painted walls 6 to 7 feet high, required standing or a ladder. No witnesses, just evidence. Door kicked in, spray paint high on walls, footprints in mud outside. No wheelchair tracks, no ramp. 3 steps to the front door, no alternative entrance. Vanessa returned at 8:30 a.m., called 911. Officer Rodriguez took her statement. She immediately identified her ex-husband Terrell Lawson as the suspect, said he'd been angry about the divorce, said he needed money, said he was black and probably on drugs or desperate. Rodriguez documented the statement, but noted internally it seemed based on assumption rather than evidence. Detective Coleman was assigned, reviewed Vanessa's statement, saw ex-husband, angry, needs money. Decided Terrell was primary suspect without checking whether the physical evidence matched the accusation. Wednesday afternoon, Coleman called Terrell and asked him to come to the station for questioning. Terrell recognized his ex-wife's address. Asked if Jasmine was okay. Coleman said she was fine, but he needed to ask questions. Terrell agreed. He hadn't done anything. He decided to cooperate without a lawyer. 3:45 p.m. Terrell arrived at the police station, parked in accessible parking, transferred to his wheelchair, rolled up the ramp and through the front doors into the lobby. He approached the front desk and identified himself. The desk officer looked at him, looked at the wheelchair, told him to wait in the seating area. 4:15 p.m. Detective Coleman appeared in the lobby, looked at Terrell, looked at the wheelchair. His expression didn't change. "Mr. Lawson, we need to talk." This is where it began. Coleman didn't take Terrell to an interrogation room. He questioned him right there in the police station lobby. Security cameras recorded everything. Body cameras recorded everything. Civilians waiting in the lobby watched. Coleman accused Terrell of burglarizing his ex-wife's house. Said the door had been kicked in. Said walls had been spray-painted. Said Vanessa had identified him as the perpetrator. Terrell explained calmly that he didn't break into Vanessa's house. That he physically couldn't have. That he was paralyzed from the waist down and had been for 15 years. That he couldn't kick in a door because he couldn't use his legs. That he couldn't spray paint walls 7 feet high because he couldn't stand. That he couldn't even access Vanessa's house because it had 3 steps and no ramp. Coleman's response was immediate and dismissive. He said wheelchair doesn't mean you can't commit crimes. He said he'd seen people fake disabilities before. Terrell stared at him in disbelief. He'd been paralyzed for 15 years. He had medical records, MRI scans showing complete spinal cord injury at the T10 vertebra. He asked if Coleman really thought he was faking being in a wheelchair for 15 years. Coleman said people were capable of a lot when motivated. Said Terrell needed money. Said Terrell knew the house. Said Terrell had motive. Terrell's voice remained steady, but the frustration was building. He paid child support on time every month. He worked full-time. He didn't need money. And more importantly, he physically could not kick in a door. Did Coleman understand what paralysis meant? Coleman wasn't interested in understanding. He suggested maybe Terrell had help. Maybe he directed someone else to do it. Terrell felt anger rising. This was insane. Coleman was creating a conspiracy theory because he couldn't accept the obvious fact that Terrell couldn't have done that. Terrell's wheelchair was sitting right in front of him. Terrell was clearly paralyzed. The crime scene evidence showed someone with working legs had committed this crime. Coleman stood up, announced in the middle of the police station lobby that he was placing Terrell Lawson under arrest for burglary, theft, and vandalism. Terrell asked what evidence Coleman had. Coleman cited Vanessa's statement and Terrell's lack of alibi. Terrell pointed out that his lack of alibi was simply being home alone at 2 a.m., where most people were, and that he had a complete physical alibi. He could not physically do what Coleman was accusing him of. He could not kick, stand, walk, or climb stairs. Coleman pulled out handcuffs in the middle of the lobby, told Terrell to turn around and put his hands behind his back. Terrell explained he was in a wheelchair and couldn't turn around the way Coleman was thinking. Coleman repeated the command, "Put your hands behind your back." Terrell looked around the lobby. Other officers were watching. Civilians were watching. Officer Brennan stood nearby. No one was intervening. Terrell slowly put his hands behind his back while remaining seated in his wheelchair. He said quietly that this was wrong, that Coleman was making a mistake. Coleman moved behind the wheelchair, grabbed Terrell's wrists, pulled them back and up to apply the handcuffs. The physics were inevitable. Terrell was seated in a manual wheelchair. His balance depended on his hands on the wheels, his core strength, his positioning. When Coleman yanked his arms back and up, Terrell's center of gravity shifted forward. The wheelchair, no longer stabilized by his hands, tipped. Terrell tried to warn him, but it was too late. The wheelchair tipped forward. Terrell fell out of the chair onto the hard tile floor of the police station lobby. He landed on his left side. His head hit first, then his shoulder, then his ribs. He couldn't catch himself because Coleman was holding his hands behind him. The impact knocked the wind out of him. He lay on the floor in the middle of the lobby, gasping for air, pain radiating through his left side, while Coleman stood over him, completing the handcuffing. Everyone in the lobby had just watched a detective pull a paralyzed man out of his wheelchair. Terrell lay on the police station lobby floor, handcuffed, unable to move his lower body, unable to get himself back into his wheelchair without his hands. In front of everyone, the floor was cold and hard. His head throbbed where it had hit. His ribs ached. He could feel those injuries. His spinal cord injury was at T10, so he had normal sensation from mid-chest upward. The pain was sharp and getting worse. Below his waist, nothing. He couldn't feel his legs to know if they were injured. He couldn't assess whether his hips or knees had been damaged in the fall. That terrified him more than the pain he could feel. He asked for help, said he needed to get back in his chair. Coleman told him he should have cooperated. Terrell raised his voice. He had been cooperating. Coleman had pulled him out of his chair. He couldn't get up on his own. He needed his wheelchair. Coleman told Officer Brennan to get him up. Brennan didn't move, said Terrell was resisting. Terrell's voice rose higher, echoing through the lobby. He wasn't resisting. He was paralyzed. He couldn't stand up. He needed someone to help him back into his wheelchair. Coleman walked away, started filling out paperwork at the front desk. Made a comment about how if Terrell couldn't get up, maybe he couldn't commit burglary either. Terrell shouted back that was exactly what he'd been trying to tell Coleman. And then he lay there, minutes passing. 3, 5, 8, 10. He requested medical attention, said he'd hit his head when he fell, said he might have a concussion. Coleman said he'd get medical after he was processed. Terrell said he needed help now, that this was a medical emergency. Officer Brennan said he seemed fine. Terrell explained he couldn't feel his legs to know if they were injured, that he couldn't assess his own condition below his waist, that this was a medical emergency under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Coleman said Terrell would see the nurse when they booked him. Terrell invoked his ADA rights explicitly, said he was requesting immediate medical attention, said Coleman was legally required to provide reasonable accommodation for his disability. Coleman continued his paperwork. Brennan stood watching. Officers walked past Terrell on the floor. Civilians came to the front desk to report incidents, stepped around him. No one helped. At minute 10, Terrell felt wetness on his temple, blood. His head was bleeding from where it had hit the floor. At minute 12, the pain in his ribs intensified. He wondered if they were broken. Wondered if he was bleeding internally. At minute 15, he felt dizzy, nauseous. Classic concussion symptoms. He'd had a concussion before, years ago during basketball. He recognized the feeling. He tried again, pleading now. Please, I think I have a concussion. I need medical help. Please. Silence from Coleman and Brennan. The lobby continued its normal business around him. At minute 17, the door to the administrative offices opened and Police Chief Diane Reeves walked into the lobby. Chief Diane Reeves had been appointed 8 months earlier with a mandate to reform the department after a series of misconduct scandals. She'd been in a meeting in the administrative wing when someone mentioned there was a commotion in the lobby. She walked through the door and stopped. A black man lay handcuffed on the lobby floor, blood visible on his temple. An empty wheelchair sat a few feet away. Detective Coleman was at the front desk doing paperwork. Officer Brennan stood nearby. Other officers and civilians moved through the lobby as if this were normal. Reeves's voice cut through the lobby. What the hell is going on here? Coleman looked up. Chief, we're processing an arrest. Burglary suspect. Reeves walked quickly to where Terrell lay on the floor. Why is he on the floor? Coleman explained that Terrell had fallen during the arrest. Reeves knelt down near Terrell. Sir, are you injured? Terrell's voice was weak. I need medical attention. I hit my head when I fell. I've been on this floor 17 minutes. I need my wheelchair. I'm paralyzed from the waist down, and I can't assess potential injuries to my lower body. Reeves stood and turned to Coleman and Brennan. Her voice was controlled but deadly. Get him back in his chair, right now. Coleman started to explain that they were just following procedure. Reeves cut him off. I said now. Uncuff him and get him in his chair immediately. Coleman removed the handcuffs. Both Coleman and Brennan moved to help Terrell back into his wheelchair. They did it clumsily, roughly, clearly having zero training in how to assist a wheelchair user. They essentially lifted him by his armpits and dropped him into the chair. It was undignified and painful. But Terrell was back in his chair. Reeves pulled out her phone and called for paramedics to respond to the police station. Head injury, potential concussion, patient paralyzed from the waist down, been on the floor approximately 17 minutes. She turned to Terrell. I'm Chief Reeves. Medical is on the way. Can you tell me what happened? Terrell took a breath and explained. He'd come voluntarily for questioning about a burglary at his ex-wife's house. Coleman had accused him of kicking in the door and spray painting walls. Terrell had explained he was paralyzed from the waist down and had been for 15 years. That he physically couldn't kick in a door because he couldn't use his legs. That he couldn't spray paint walls 7 feet high because he couldn't stand. That he couldn't even access his ex-wife's house because it had 3 steps and no ramp. Coleman had said wheelchair doesn't mean he can't commit crimes, had said people fake disabilities, had tried to arrest him right there in the lobby. When Coleman handcuffed him, he'd pulled Terrell's arms back and Terrell had fallen out of his wheelchair, had landed on his head and ribs. Terrell had asked for help, had asked for medical attention, had invoked his ADA rights. They'd left him on the floor for 17 minutes and refused to help. Reeves looked at Coleman. He's paralyzed? Coleman said Terrell claimed he was. Terrell said quietly that he'd been paralyzed 15 years. Complete T10 spinal cord injury. Documented in medical records. Visible to anyone with eyes. He was in a wheelchair. Reeves asked Coleman what evidence he had that Terrell committed this burglary. Coleman cited the ex-wife's identification and Terrell's supposed motive. Reeves asked about physical evidence from the crime scene. Coleman checked his file and said the door had been kicked in and the frame was splintered. Reeves pointed out that Terrell was paralyzed from the waist down, which meant he couldn't kick. She asked about the spray paint. Coleman said walls were painted 6 to 7 feet high. Reeves noted that Terrell used a wheelchair, which meant he couldn't reach 7 feet high without standing, which he couldn't do because he was paralyzed. She asked if Coleman had verified whether the house had wheelchair access. Coleman said nothing. Reeves asked Terrell directly, "Does your ex-wife's house have a ramp or accessible entrance?" Terrell said no. 3 steps to the front door. No ramp anywhere. He physically could not enter that house. Reeves turned back to Coleman and Brennan and laid out exactly what they'd done. They'd arrested a man paralyzed from the waist down for a crime requiring working legs. They'd done this based solely on an ex-wife's accusation. They hadn't verified whether he could physically access the crime scene. They hadn't checked whether he could physically perform the actions described. They'd caused him to fall from his wheelchair in the middle of the police station lobby. They'd left him on the floor for 17 minutes while he requested medical attention and invoked his ADA rights. They'd refused to help him. Silence filled the lobby. Get out. Both of you. You're suspended pending investigation. You're both going to be named in the lawsuit that's coming. Paramedics arrived 4 minutes later. They assessed Terrell carefully. Concussion confirmed. Laceration on his temple, requiring stitches. Bruised ribs, possible broken rib. They transported him to the hospital. Reeves personally called Terrell's emergency contact, his daughter Jasmine, and explained what had happened. She told her which hospital to go to. While Terrell was being treated, Reeves pulled the lobby security camera footage and the body camera footage from Coleman and Brennan. She watched the entire 17-minute sequence. Watched Coleman dismiss Terrell's explanation of his paralysis. Watched the fall. Watched Terrell on the floor calling for help. Watched 2 officers and multiple other people in the lobby do nothing. She called the city attorney's office and told them to prepare for a major lawsuit. Civil rights violation, ADA violation, excessive force, deliberate indifference. The video evidence was damning and it all happened in public view. She called the district attorney and opened an investigation into whether criminal charges should be filed against Coleman and Brennan for assault and violation of civil rights. And she called Terrell's ex-wife Vanessa and informed her that her false accusation had resulted in her ex-husband being arrested, physically injured, and denied medical care. That he'd suffered a concussion and broken rib because of her false report. That she would be receiving paperwork regarding potential charges for filing a false police report. And that she should retain an attorney because Terrell would likely be suing her as well. 6 weeks later, Terrell Lawson filed suit against the city police department, Detective Isaiah Coleman, and Officer Kyle Brennan. The claims included false arrest without probable cause, violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act through failure to accommodate and failure to provide medical assistance, civil rights violations, excessive force causing fall from wheelchair and injuries, failure to provide medical care despite repeated requests, deliberate indifference to serious medical needs, racial discrimination, disability discrimination, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The evidence was overwhelming, and much of it was captured on video that had already been viewed by thousands of people online. The lobby security camera footage showed the entire incident from multiple angles. Coleman questioning Terrell at the front desk. Terrell explaining his paralysis. Coleman's dismissive responses. The handcuffing attempt. The wheelchair tipping. Terrell falling and hitting the floor. The 17 minutes that followed, with Terrell on the floor requesting help while officers and civilians moved through the lobby. All of it captured in high definition from multiple camera angles. Coleman's body camera captured the exchange in even more detail, including the exact moment when Coleman said, "Wheelchair doesn't mean you can't commit crimes. I've seen people fake disabilities before." And later, after Terrell fell, Coleman's comment that if you can't get up, maybe you can't commit burglary either. The crime scene photos from Vanessa's house showed the physical impossibility of Terrell's involvement. The front door had been kicked in with significant force, the frame splintered, and the deadbolt broken. This required standing position and significant leg strength that Terrell physiologically did not possess. The spray paint on the living room and kitchen walls ranged from 6 to 7 feet high, requiring either standing or use of a ladder. Photos of Vanessa's house exterior showed 3 steps leading to the front door with no ramp, no accessible entrance, and no way for a wheelchair user to independently access the property. Terrell's medical records established 15 years of documented paralysis. MRI scans showed complete T10 spinal cord injury. Rehabilitation records documented his initial injury and ongoing care. Adaptive equipment prescriptions. 15 years of consistent medical documentation proving his paralysis was permanent, complete, and real. Expert testimony came from multiple specialists. Dr. Sarah Chen, a spinal cord injury specialist, explained that a T10 complete injury meant 0 motor function below mid-chest level, no ability to stand, walk, or kick. The crime alleged required leg strength that Terrell physiologically did not possess, and had not possessed for 15 years. It would be like accusing a blind person of a crime requiring vision, physically impossible. Michael Torres, a wheelchair accessibility consultant, examined Vanessa's house and documented that it was completely inaccessible to wheelchair users. No ramp, steps at all entrances, no alternative access points. Even if Terrell had wanted to enter the house, he would have required assistance from able-bodied people to physically lift him and his wheelchair up the steps. Professor Linda Washington, an ADA compliance expert, testified that officers were legally required to accommodate disabilities during arrests. That pulling a wheelchair user's arms behind their back created obvious fall risk. That leaving someone on the floor for 17 minutes after they requested medical help was deliberate indifference to a serious medical need. That ignoring explicit invocations of ADA rights was a federal violation. The smoking gun evidence came from Coleman's own words captured on his body camera. His statement that wheelchair doesn't mean you can't commit crimes, and his admission that he'd seen people fake disabilities, proved he knew Terrell claimed physical inability to commit the crime, but dismissed the disability as fake. His later comment about Terrell not being able to commit burglary if he couldn't get up proved Coleman understood the physical impossibility after causing harm, but had proceeded with the arrest anyway despite knowing it was baseless. The trial began 14 months after the incident. Terrell testified on day 3. He described the accident 15 years ago, the rehabilitation, learning to live from a wheelchair, being a father to Jasmine, coaching adaptive basketball for kids with disabilities, building a life. Then he described what happened in the police station lobby. He'd explained to Detective Coleman that he was paralyzed and had been for 15 years, that he couldn't kick in a door because he couldn't use his legs, that he couldn't spray paint walls 7 feet high because he couldn't stand, that he couldn't access his ex-wife's house because it had steps and no ramp. Coleman had told him wheelchair doesn't mean you can't commit crimes, had told him people fake disabilities, had looked at him sitting in his wheelchair and decided he was either faking his paralysis or that his paralysis didn't matter. When Coleman had handcuffed him, he'd pulled Terrell's arms back. Terrell had told him he was pulling him off balance. Coleman had kept pulling. Terrell had fallen, had hit his head on the concrete lobby floor, had hit his ribs, couldn't catch himself because Coleman was holding his hands. For 17 minutes, Terrell had lain on that floor, had asked for help, had asked for medical attention, had told them he had a head injury, had told them he couldn't assess potential injuries to his lower body because he was paralyzed and couldn't feel below his waist, had invoked his ADA rights explicitly. Coleman had told him he'd get medical after processing. Brennan had stood watching and done nothing. For 17 minutes, Terrell had lain there in the middle of the police station lobby, bleeding from his head, in pain, scared, calling for help, while officers and civilians walked past. And they had refused to help. His voice broke. Not because they couldn't help, because they decided I didn't deserve help. The expert witnesses provided the scientific and legal framework that made the injustice undeniable. Dr. Chen explained the physiology of spinal cord injury. Torres demonstrated the accessibility barriers. Professor Washington detailed the legal violations. But the most devastating testimony came during the cross-examination of Detective Coleman. The plaintiff's attorney played the body camera footage and stopped at the moment Coleman said wheelchair doesn't mean you can't commit crimes. The attorney asked Coleman what he meant by that statement. Coleman said he'd seen people in wheelchairs commit crimes before. The attorney asked if he'd seen people with complete spinal cord injuries kick in doors. Silence. Had he reviewed Terrell's medical records before making that statement? No. Had he consulted with any medical professional about whether a paraplegic could perform the actions alleged? No. Had he examined the crime scene photos showing the door was kicked in with force requiring leg strength? Yes. And looking at Terrell, clearly paralyzed, sitting in a wheelchair in front of him, Coleman had still believed he kicked in that door? Coleman said he'd thought maybe Terrell had help. The attorney asked if Coleman's theory was that Terrell had directed someone else to kick in his ex-wife's door while he watched from his wheelchair. Coleman said it was possible. The attorney asked if it was also possible Coleman simply didn't want to admit he'd arrested the wrong person. No response. The attorney then played the clip of Coleman saying if you can't get up, maybe you can't commit burglary either. The attorney asked if this statement suggested Coleman understood at that moment that Terrell's inability to stand meant he couldn't commit the crime. Coleman said he was being sarcastic. The attorney asked if Coleman was being sarcastic while a man he'd just injured lay on the floor bleeding and asking for help. No response. How long had Terrell lain on that floor? About 17 minutes. How many times had he requested medical assistance? Coleman said he didn't remember exactly. The video showed 7 times. He'd invoked ADA rights twice. He'd explained he had a head injury and couldn't assess his lower body because of his paralysis. And Coleman had responded by saying he'd get medical after processing. Why? Coleman said he was following procedure, which procedure required leaving an injured person on the floor for 17 minutes when they were asking for help. Silence. The jury deliberated 4 hours. Liable on all counts. 14 months after the incident, settlement reached $12.4 million. $4.4 million to Terrell for false arrest, ADA violations, excessive force, denial of medical care, emotional distress. $8 million punitive damages against the department, Coleman, and Brennan. Coleman terminated for cause, barred from law enforcement in the state, personally liable, $400,000. 5 prior excessive force complaints reopened, all found meritorious. Court ordered 500 hours disability awareness training. Brennan suspended 180 days without pay. Demoted, required 300 hours ADA training, permanent file notation. Remained on probation only. Vanessa faced separate civil suit from Terrell, settled for $200,000. Lost primary custody of Jasmine after family court reviewed her false report and racial assumptions. Ordered to pay Terrell's legal fees, $45,000. Chief Reeves used the case to mandate comprehensive reforms. All officers required 80 hours ADA training. New protocols for disability accommodation during arrests. Immediate medical response mandatory. Physical evidence review required before arrests. If suspect has physical disability, officers must verify physical capability to commit alleged crime. State lawmakers passed Marcus's Law, requiring law enforcement to accommodate disabilities, codifying physical impossibility defense, increasing penalties for false reporting against people with disabilities, making ADA training mandatory for certification. 18 months after settlement, Terrell has primary custody of Jasmine, now 17 and preparing for college. He established the Lawson Foundation for Disability Rights, providing legal support for disabled people facing discrimination, funding accessibility improvements, creating scholarships for disabled students pursuing law. He continues working as adjuster and coaching adaptive basketball. Added new work, testifying at police academies about disability awareness, speaking at city council about accessibility, advocating at state legislature. Last month, his testimony was instrumental in passing additional protections. When he speaks publicly, his message is uncompromising. For 17 minutes, I lay on that floor while officers and civilians refused to help. Not because they couldn't, because they decided I didn't deserve help. Coleman saw my wheelchair and decided I was faking or that my disability didn't matter. Both are ableism disabled people face daily. This time it was on video and cost $12.4 million. Most times there's no video. Most times disabled people are just left on the floor. Jasmine lives with her father, testified in custody hearing about her mother's lies. My mom told police my dad broke into her house. He can't walk. He's been in a wheelchair my entire life. He can't kick in a door, spray paint walls 7 feet high, or climb 3 steps. But police believed her because she's not in a wheelchair, and he is. And because he's black, and she made him sound dangerous. She used his race and disability as weapons. That's why I chose to live with him. Chief Reeves used this case as foundation for reform. The footage became training tool in academies statewide. When I walked in and saw a man handcuffed on the floor, bleeding, with officers and civilians walking past like he wasn't there, I knew we had failed. This exposed how ableism and racism intersect. Officers see a black man and assume criminality, see a wheelchair and assume it's fake or irrelevant. Both are dangerous. Both lead to injustice. Coleman terminated, banned from law enforcement. During deposition, I've seen people in wheelchairs get up and walk. I've seen people fake disabilities. How was I supposed to know he was really paralyzed? Asked if he'd checked medical records. No. Consulted medical professionals. No. Final question. Is it possible you didn't want to admit you'd arrested the wrong person? No answer. Brennan transferred to desk position. In victim impact statement, I watched Coleman pull Mr. Lawson's arms back, saw the wheelchair tip, watched him fall and hit his head. Did nothing. He asked for help, invoked ADA rights, explained he had a head injury. I stood there. I told myself I was following Coleman's lead, but truth is, I was scared to speak up. Mr. Lawson paid the price for my silence. Vanessa lost custody, filed bankruptcy. In family court. I thought Terrell did it because who else would target my house? He's always been angry. He's black, and I thought maybe he was on drugs or needed money. I didn't think about the wheelchair, that he couldn't physically do it. Judge's response. You saw your ex-husband's race and made assumptions that led to his false arrest, physical injury, civil rights violation. You will not have primary custody while you hold these beliefs. I've been in a wheelchair 15 years. I've faced ableism before. The stairs, assumptions, buildings without ramps, people who talk to whoever I'm with instead of me. But lying on that police station lobby floor 17 minutes was different. That was active cruelty witnessed by dozens. Coleman looked at my wheelchair and decided I was faking or that my disability didn't matter. Either way, he arrested me for a crime requiring legs I don't have. When his actions caused me to fall and hit my head, he left me there. Not because he couldn't help, because he decided I didn't deserve help. Brennan watched, had the power to intervene, had the duty, chose silence. I paid the price. The 12.4 million matters. The reforms matter. The training matters. But what matters most is what this exposed: the intersection of racism and ableism in law enforcement. Officers who see a black man and assume criminality, see a wheelchair and assume deception or irrelevance. My wheelchair was right in front of them. My paralysis was obvious. The evidence showed the crime required legs. They arrested me anyway. That's not training failure. That's failure of basic human observation and compassion. Failure to see disabled people as people. Failure to believe us about our own bodies. The Lawson Foundation works to change that. We fund legal support for disabled people facing discrimination. We push for accessibility. We advocate for reform. Because if a paralyzed man can be arrested for a crime requiring legs, if he can be left on the floor 17 minutes calling for help with witnesses present, then the work of justice is far from finished. Every time I roll through the city, I see changes, new ramps, accessible facilities, officers through new training. But I also see work remaining, buildings without access, assumptions still made, disabled people still fighting to be believed about their bodies. That lobby floor was cold and hard. 17 minutes felt like hours. But those 17 minutes in public view with cameras exposed something that needed to be seen. The wheelchair doesn't lie. The medical records don't lie. The physics don't lie. It's time law enforcement started believing all three. Thank you for watching. I will see you in the next story.